Settle in and dim the lights. Tonight we ride along the quiet routes of Long Island, where the garbage trucks hum and the past never quite stays buried. Settle in, lower the lights, and let this calm crime story follow an old mob figure whose world shrank from city-wide routes to tiny small street and a single trash can at the curb. You are welcome to leave a comment below with your local time and location if you want. Take a slow breath, relax your shoulders, and let us step gently into the story together. Chapter 1. The Man in the Passenger Seat. The first sound that reached Salvatore in the morning was not birds or traffic. It was the low, familiar growl of a truck somewhere at the far end of the block. He lay still in his bed in Suffolk County and let the noise roll through the quiet house like a slow tide. The engine rose and fell, a backup alarm chimed softly, and then a metal bin clanged in the distance. He smiled to himself, a small private smile that no one else ever saw, and only then did he swing his feet onto the floor. His knees complained, the way old knees do, but they still worked. That counted for something. He reached for his robe, the same plain robe he had worn for years, and shuffled toward the kitchen, following the scent of last night's coffee grounds. The house was modest and clean, nothing that would draw attention. The linoleum in the kitchen was a bit worn along the path between the counter and the table, where his steps had traced the same line morning after morning. On the refrigerator door, a couple of magnets held up a faded snapshot of grandchildren at a school play. A grandchild in a paper crown, another with too much glitter on a costume. No one looking at the picture would guess that the man who kept it had once been described in court as a powerful figure. He filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and checked the window above the sink. Out on the street the world was half awake. A neighbor in a bathrobe collected a newspaper from the front walk. A jogger in bright shoes trotted past, earbuds in, oblivious to everything but the beat in his head. The truck sound came again. Salvatore leaned forward and saw it at the corner, a modern front loader with a bright corporate logo on the side. The crew wore matching vests and hard hats, everything regulation, everything tidy. They worked quickly, cans up, cans down, arms moving like parts of a machine. No one shouted, no one argued. For a moment the sight layered itself onto an older picture in his mind. Another truck, older and a little dented, with a different name on the door. The uniforms were just jackets and caps back then, and the crew argued about baseball while they worked. On those mornings he would have been up even earlier, not as a spectator behind a curtain, but as a man with a route and responsibilities, and a phone that never seemed to stop ringing. The kettle whistled softly. He turned away from the window, poured hot water over the coffee in the small metal pot he used, and let the steam rise to meet him. The smell pulled him fully into the present. He moved slowly but with deliberate care as he set his single mug on the table, unfolded the local paper, and slid on a pair of reading glasses. He read the headlines the way some people say a rosary, one line at a time, patient and steady. Local tax issues, a school board dispute, an article about increased recycling regulations in the county, with a photo of bins lined up like soldiers on a curb. When he reached that story, he stopped and looked at the photo for a long time. The world had found new words for old habits: stewardship, sustainability, compliance, words that in his younger days would have been translated differently around certain tables. Back then the concern had been simpler. Was the truck on the right block at the right time? Was the envelope sent to the right office? Was the price on the invoice the agreed price, no more and definitely no less? He took a sip of coffee, feeling the warmth settle in his chest. The clock on the wall ticked in a calm, stubborn way. Time kept its own schedule, one that no one could fix or rig. As he finished the article, he could hear another truck somewhere deeper in the neighborhood. He thought of it like a distant cousin of the old fleet, updated and rebranded. He imagined the dispatcher in a clean office, staring at a computer screen that showed routes as colored lines instead of notes on a clipboard. The routes were still there. The names had changed. The rules had changed. The rhythm had not. It was funny, he thought, how a life could be reduced in official papers to lines about racketeering and conspiracies. The papers never mentioned the small details. They never mentioned the way a man could look at a row of addresses and feel, almost physically, how the trucks and crews had to move so that every can was emptied and every customer stayed just satisfied enough not to call the competition or the police. The courts had called it a cartel. To him, it had always felt more like a complicated family business with too many uncles and more cousins than anyone could count. He finished his coffee and rinsed the mug. In the mirror over the sink, his reflection regarded him calmly. The hair was thin and white now, the eyes were still dark, still watchful. There were lines around his mouth from frowning, and a few from smiling, although the smiling ones had taken longer to carve themselves in. He pulled on a jacket and stepped outside to fetch his own trash can. He had set it out the night before, like any other resident on his block. The lid rattled when he lifted it. There was no special arrangement, no private service. He paid the town fee like everyone else. That fact amused him more than he would admit. As he rolled the can back up the driveway, he saw Mrs. Costello from across the street waving at him, her small dog tugging at its leash. She was friendly, chatty, and blissfully uninformed about his past. To her, he was just Mr. Avellino, the quiet older neighbour who sometimes helped bring in her groceries. She called out a greeting about the weather, about how the cold was creeping in earlier this year. He nodded and answered in a few polite sentences, letting her do most of the talking. That had always been none of his best skills, really. Other people filled silences with words. He let silences do some of the work. When he went back inside, he checked the small digital clock on the counter. It was still early. He had an errand to run, and after that a visit expected. An old associate had called the night before, speaking in careful phrases that were almost comically cautious, given how long both of them had been out of the main game. He remembered the voice on the phone saying that he wanted to catch up, maybe talk about how the business had changed, see if Sal still recognized the old landscape. There had been a chuckle on the line, tired and a little hoarse. The call had taken him back for a moment, back to a time when the phone never stopped, back to when he was younger, stronger, and usually in the driver's seat of a car heading toward Queens as the sky over the city glowed in shades of orange and purple. In those days, late at night, the roads from Long Island into the city were his private corridors. He would slide behind the wheel of a dark sedan, adjust the mirror, and wait for Tony Ducks to settle into the passenger seat. Tony would close the door with a precise motion and say in that dry voice of his that the weather was not bad, or that the traffic was heavier than expected, or that the radio had nothing but junk to offer. Always something small and ordinary first. They would roll down the expressway, headlights washing over the long curves of asphalt. The city skyline would slowly rise ahead of them, a jagged row of dark shapes against the lighter sky. Streetlights flickered by like beads on a string. In the car, the conversation was never about the worst possibilities. It was about drivers who needed a talking to because they were late too often, about customers who complained too loudly, about a union guy who wanted reassurances that the men would be taken care of. Every so often, Tony would ask about Salvatore's family. One line. "How is your wife? How are the kids?" The tone always made it sound like part of the ledger, another account to keep balanced. Salvatore had liked those drives, in a quiet way. Behind the wheel he felt the weight of responsibility, but he also felt a certain peace. The road did not ask questions. The car moved forward, and his hands knew what to do. Those days were gone now, but they lived in him like old songs that could still be hummed without thinking. He shook himself gently from the memory, gathered his keys, and stepped out into the cool air. The sky was pale and high, streaked with light cloud. He got into his modest car, a practical choice with good mileage, and eased out of the driveway. The streets were familiar, though dotted now with new stores and redesigned intersections. As he drove, his mind drifted back across time, following the old route as if superimposed on the new, past the strip mall that used to be a smaller set of shops, past a side road that once led to a transfer station, now closed and covered with carefully landscaped soil in the name of environmental health. He made his errand quick. a stop at a small grocery for fresh bread and a few odds and ends. The cashier, a young woman with headphones around her neck, barely glanced at him. That was fine. Anonymity was its own luxury. When he returned home, the afternoon had just started to lean toward evening. The light turned softer, the shadows on the street stretching a little longer. He put away the groceries and set a small pot of sauce on the stove, low and steady. The house began to smell like tomatoes and basil. The knock on the door came just as he was wiping his hands on a towel. He knew who it was before he opened it. There was a way old associates knocked, a rhythm that was not quite like neighbors or delivery people. He opened the door to a man roughly his age, though a bit heavier. The visitor wore a good coat and an expression that mixed caution and warmth, like someone approaching a dog that used to bite but had long since lost most of its teeth. They greeted each other without fuss. No handshake theatrics, no long exclamations, just a name spoken, a nod, a step inside. They settled at the kitchen table with coffee, steam curling between them. The talk began with the usual topics: health, grandchildren, the strange speed of time. Then, inevitably, it turned toward the old trade. The visitor told him that the routes were different now. Everything was bidding and contracts and electronic records. No one wanted cash. No one wanted to hear about an arrangement. If a customer did not like the service, they called a toll-free number and complained. There was a whole department for that. The visitor shook his head, half annoyed, half impressed. He said that the days when a word from the right person could settle a dispute were mostly gone. Now you needed permits, consultants, and public relations plans. Salvatore listened, nodding slowly. Inside, he felt both left behind and strangely relieved. His guest told him about new targets for recycling and about cameras mounted on trucks to make sure drivers followed the rules. He described safety trainings and online courses, words that felt almost foreign in that kitchen with its older cabinets and simple tablecloth. For each new development, Salvatore found an older echo. Cameras were just the latest version of an extra set of eyes from the office. Recycling targets were another form of pressure from above, something to be managed with a combination of careful work and quiet bending of the rules. The difference, he thought, was that now the rules came with thick manuals instead of nods and winks, and the consequences, when things went wrong, arrived in letters and hearings instead of quiet meetings in parked cars. They shared a small laugh over that, not because any of it was especially funny, but because old men talking about the past always seemed to find some way to laugh at it. As the sky outside darkened, the conversation drifted toward the inevitable subject of regret. Not directly. No one at that table used that word. Instead, they talked about the old names who were no longer around, men who had gone to their rest early, or had spent long years inside. Salvatore did not speak much about his own time away. He did not need to. The other man knew the outline. It had been written in news stories and court documents, stacked in dusty boxes somewhere in federal storage. He simply said that time had a way of stripping away excuses. The visitor nodded. Later, when his guest had gone and the kitchen was quiet again, Salvatore stood at the window and watched the streetlights blink on. A late truck passed at the far corner, lights glowing in the dusk. He listened to the familiar engine tone fade into the distance. It struck him that for all the changes, the world still needed someone to carry away what people did not want to see. It had always been like that. He had been part of that work in a complicated, sometimes wrong way. Now others did it under stricter rules, wearing brighter uniforms, but the basic truth remained. He turned off the kitchen light and let the house settle around him. Tomorrow would come with its own routine. For tonight, he was just a man in a quiet house on Long Island, listening to the soft echo of old engines in his memory, and preparing himself, without knowing exactly why, for more memories to rise. Chapter 2: Garbage Routes and Quiet Rules. Before the trials, before the headlines, before the attorneys with their briefcases and careful smiles, there had been mornings that felt almost simple. Salvatore remembered one such morning as clearly as if it were pressed like a leaf between the pages of a book. The kitchen table was covered with a worn plastic cloth patterned with small blue flowers. Over it lay a large folding map of Long Island and the outer boroughs, edges curling up like a tired dog. His children were still half asleep in front of the television in the next room, watching cartoons, their laughter drifting in now and then. His wife moved between stove and sink with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned how to work around a man who kept odd hours. On the map, coloured lines traced the known world of their trade. Salvatore leaned over it with a pencil in hand and a cup of coffee in the other. He had marked the routes so often that some streets looked like veins clogged with ink. He murmured street names under his breath as he checked each line. Merrick, Jericho, Sunrise, Northern. Side streets branched off in every direction, little threads connecting bars, restaurants, warehouses, butcher shops, office buildings, and all the other small places that produced trash the way some people produced gossip. He was not thinking about crime, he was thinking about time. If Truck A started here and moved there, how long would it take before the driver was too far from the dump to make a second run before closing? If Truck B got stuck behind a school bus every morning, was it better to reroute it or to accept the delay? These were the puzzles that suited him. Crosswords, not chess, but the stubborn problem of moving heavy vehicles through crowded streets while keeping everyone reasonably content. Every now and then his wife would pass behind him, glance at the map, and ask in a gentle tone if there was any chance he would be home for dinner that night. He would answer that he would try. They both knew what that meant. The phone on the wall rang. He checked his watch out of habit, then answered. A dispatcher from one of the yards wanted to confirm a change to the list. There was a bakery that had switched ownership and was trying to bargain the price down. Another truck had a starter problem. Could they swap routes until the mechanic arrived? Salvatore wrote small notes in the margins of the map, arrows and abbreviations. To anyone else it would have looked like a mess. To him, it was a living thing, a picture of the day ahead. Later that morning he drove to the Union Hall near the city line, the home for the men of a certain local, where parking was always a negotiation and cigarettes were almost part of the wallpaper. The building was not impressive, a brick box with a flat roof and a fading sign out front. Inside, though, it had its own gravity. Drivers, helpers and shop stewards drifted through, some with coffee cups, some with rolled newspapers, some with faces that said they had already had one argument too many and the sun was barely up. The air smelled of coffee, exhaust carried in on work jackets, and the faint tang of paperwork that had been handled by too many fingers. A television in the corner played the morning news with the sound low. Salvatore moved through the crowd with easy familiarity. He knew almost every face, and they knew his. Where a passerby might have seen a loose collection of workers, he saw an informal orchestra. Each man had a part to play, a rhythm to keep. Any hour of them could make his day more difficult by deciding to be late, or careless, or stubborn. He greeted a group of drivers who stood around a scarred wooden table, complaining about the cold and the new safety rules that required reflective vests and more paperwork. One joked that pretty soon they would need a lawyer just to back a truck into an alley. Salvatore responded that at least the vests made them easier to see when they went for seconds at the coffee urn. The joke landed lightly. Men laughed, tension eased. Small things like that mattered more than they seemed. In a side room he met with a union representative, a man with a tired suit and sharp eyes. They discussed schedules, overtime, and the occasional stubborn worker who believed the rumours that some other company might offer better pay on the same street. There were topics that hovered in the air, unsaid but understood. Everyone in that room knew that certain routes belonged to certain people. It was not written down anywhere, not in the official contracts, not in the city records. It existed in conversations, in nods, in the way expectations were set. If a new company tried to undercut the price on a long-held route, the union might hear about problems with their drivers. Maybe a permit would suddenly take longer to process. Maybe a few trucks from other firms would just happen to appear nearby at the same time, their crews standing around, leaning against fenders, watching. No one talked about threats. They talked about stability, about keeping the peace. The word protection had many shades of meaning. Later that day, Salvatore visited one of the yards. Trucks lined up like tired animals, metal sides streaked with grime. Men moved between them with rags, tools, and thermos bottles. Engines coughed and roared to life. He watched as a dispatcher stood with a clipboard reading off assignments. Each name matched with a truck, a route, and a helper. Some drivers rolled their eyes at difficult stops. Some muttered about tight alleys and cranky store owners. But in the end, they climbed into their cabs and went to work. A younger man named Frankie approached Salvatore with a question about a particular restaurant on a busy corner. The owner, Frankie said, kept hinting about a cheaper deal from someone else. Should he ignore it, or should he mention it to the boss? Salvatore listened, then told him calmly that some places would always grumble. The important thing was to keep the service smooth and the pickups on time. If the owner pushed too hard, there were ways to remind him of the value of stability. Maybe a friendly conversation. Maybe a visit from someone whose opinion he respected. No need to raise voices. Frankie nodded, reassured. He did not ask who that someone might be. He did not need to. In those years, the system worked in an odd kind of harmony. Customers paid a little more than they might have in a wild, open market. In return, they rarely had to worry about missed pickups or surprise competitors. Drivers knew their routes were secure as long as they showed up and followed the loose rules. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. There were always a few who believed that competition and freedom would bring cheaper prices and better service. Salvatore had heard those speeches from lawyers, reporters, and, once in a while, from young idealistic businessmen with plans for independent hauling firms. He would nod politely and think to himself that these people had never been on the phone at 5 a.m. trying to find a substitute driver because someone was sick, while at the same time negotiating with a restaurant manager about holiday pickups. Stability had a price, he believed. He also understood, if he was honest with himself, that the way they enforced that stability was not exactly saintly. He did not dwell on that part. Not then. On some evenings, after long days of keeping trucks and people in motion, he would find himself back at the kitchen table with the map. His wife would clear away the dinner plates, and he would spread out papers showing lists of accounts, routes, and payments. He moved small coins over the map to represent trucks. 1 coin for each vehicle, sliding it along the printed streets. It amused him, the little private game that helped him visualize the flow. His wife teased him that he was playing with toys. He replied that it was cheaper than hiring consultants. Sometimes a child would wander in, see the map, and ask innocent questions about which lines were theirs. He would show them, tracing a finger along a stretch of road and saying that this one, and this one, and this one were taken care of by their people. He made it sound like a matter of pride and responsibility. In those moments, he could almost believe that he was simply a businessman with a knack for logistics. The darker edges of the enterprise stayed out of sight, like rats that avoided the light of a passing truck. Yet the quiet rules were always there, humming beneath the surface. When a small independent hauler started knocking on doors in a neighborhood that had long been tied to the established firms, word would reach him quickly. A driver would mention seeing a strange truck. A customer would casually bring up a brochure left on a counter. Salvatore would make a note. Sometimes that was all that happened. The newcomer would realize the water was too deep and move on. Sometimes, though, the newcomer would persist. In those cases, he might suggest that someone pay the independent a visit. The visitor would not go alone, and he would not arrive in an angry rush. He would pick a quiet moment, maybe early evening, when the new hauler's truck was parked and the office was thinly staffed. The conversation, as Salvatore imagined it, and as he occasionally heard it recounted, would be framed in terms of advice. The neighborhood was already taken care of. There were other territories less complicated. It would be safer and more profitable to look elsewhere. If the independent insisted on staying, then the quiet rules would adjust. Routes that had once been calm would suddenly see small inconveniences. Someone might lose track of a permit application. A supplier might decide to reconsider a contract. Nothing dramatic at first, just an accumulation of small messages. The goal was not chaos, the goal was to prevent it. That was how he thought of it in those days. The price of peace was paid in controlled pressure. From time to time, he found himself in small meetings with men who did not show up on any of the official company lists. They met in back rooms of restaurants, in social clubs where the coffee was strong and the walls held photographs of old country landscapes. There, the talk was less about trucks and more about respect. Someone might be unhappy about a rival firm stepping too close. Someone else might be worrying that a certain union official was listening too closely to outside voices. Salvatore's role in those rooms was to provide facts and to translate those facts into suggestions. He had a calm manner that made him useful. When tempers started to rise, he could lower them with a firm statement about what the routes could bear, what the men would accept, and what the customers would tolerate. He did not raise his voice. He did not pound the table. He laid out the options like items on an invoice. If they pushed too hard in one direction, this would happen. If they backed off too far, something else would happen. Occasionally, someone would hint at a more drastic solution. The room would go very quiet. Salvatore would look down at his hands and focus on the pattern of the tablecloth. Those moments made him uneasy even then. Most of the time, cooler heads prevailed. The group would settle on some arrangement that preserved the balance. A price adjustment here, a small concession there, a new understand with a union contact. When he left those meetings, stepping out into the night air, he would always pause for a second to let his eyes adjust. The city looked different after such discussions. Streetlights cast halos on wet pavement. Trucks rumbled in the distance. Ordinary people crossed intersections, carrying groceries or holding children's hands, completely unaware that their trash pickup schedules had just been protected by an invisible agreement. Back at home, the noise of that other world faded. He removed his shoes at the door. His wife might be asleep already, or reading in bed. He would check on the children, watching their quiet breathing in the dark. There were moments, brief and undefended, when he wondered what they would think if they knew exactly how their comfortable routines were maintained. Then he would push the thought away. Children did not need to know the details of shields held over them, so the days rolled on, a blend of kitchen table maps, union hall banter, yard visits, and small meetings where the real lines of the business were drawn. From the outside, the private sanitation industry looked like a simple service. You put out your garbage, it disappeared. The trucks were just loud background noise. The men driving them were just workers in stained uniforms. Inside, as Salvatore knew, there was a complex choreography. It rested on human nature as much as on any written law. People liked predictability. They did not like surprises, unless someone convinced them those surprises were cheap and safe. He ensured that surprises were rare and that anyone trying to cause too many of them felt an invisible hand on their shoulder. At the time, this seemed like a kind of justice. Later, sitting in courtrooms and cells, that belief would fray. But in the years when the system was still strong, he moved through it with the certainty of a man who trusted his own reading of the map. He did not know, on those quiet mornings and busy afternoons, that the edges of that map were already starting to curl. New regulations, new investigators, and new independent voices were waking up, somewhere beyond the lines he had drawn. For now, though, he leaned over his kitchen table, pencil in hand, tracing routes like arteries of a city that still seemed to beat to his rhythm. He sealed the latest adjustments in his mind, folded the map with practiced hands, and prepared for another day in a world where garbage was never garbage, and peace always came with a hidden invoice. Chapter 3: Echoes at the Way Station. The first time Salvatore noticed the new truck, he was standing on a low rise of packed dirt near a landfill, watching a line of vehicles inch their way toward the scale. The air smelled of diesel and old cardboard. Gulls circled lazily overhead, calling out in harsh, impatient voices that sounded like gossip. He had been talking with one of the scale operators about nothing special. Weather, a ball game, something about a new rule from the county that required extra forms for certain loads. His coat collar was turned up against the breeze, and his shoes had collected a fine grey dust that no amount of brushing would fully remove. The line of trucks was familiar. He knew most of them by sight. There was the old rear loader from a company they treated gently, a family outfit that never tried to undercut the arrangement. There was a gleaming green truck from one of the bigger firms, the kind that liked to sponsor local kids' teams for the good publicity. Then came a truck he did not recognize. The name on the cab door was smaller, not dot of the standard banners he was used to seeing. The paint job was clean but a little plain, as if the company had not yet decided how fancy it wanted to look. The truck crept forward, its driver leaning an elbow out the window. He looked younger than most of the men in the line, with a posture that said he still believed his back would never betray him. The scale operator nodded toward the new arrival. That Anne, he said softly, had been showing up more often the past few weeks. Independent outfit. Came in with a contract from a couple of commercial strips that used to belong to people Salvatore knew on a first-name basis. Salvatore watched the operation with a neutral face. He asked for the name again, as if simply trying to remember a detail for some minor paperwork. The operator repeated it. The driver eased the truck onto the scale, looked straight ahead, and waited for the wave to pull forward. There was no obvious defiance in his expression, but no nervousness either. Just a man doing his job, trusting that someone had handled the arguments for him. Salvatore filed it away. Later that week, in a modest office above a small yard, he saw the same name on a clipboard. A dispatcher, flipping through route sheets, muttered that this independent company had picked up accounts from a little stretch they had always assumed was off-limits to newcomers. The shift was small, just a handful of customers, but to men like Salvatore, such changes felt like hairline cracks in a window. If you were patient, you could see them spread. He asked who owned the outfit. A driver chimed in. He had heard names. One of them was Quebecer, another was Barstow. People said they were serious, that they had gone to court more than once, that they had some kind of civil case about the industry. The names hung in the air for a moment. Salvatore repeated them quietly. He did not know the men personally, not yet. He knew the type, though. The ones who believed that the market should be open and that agreements made in cigar smoke and coffee steam were not binding. On another morning, he glimpsed one of them at a transfer station out on the island. The man stood near his truck, talking with a worker in overalls. He had a plain jacket, a solid build, and the focused look of someone who spent more time thinking about routes than about social clubs. Salvatore did not approach. He had no reason to start that conversation, not at that point. He watched from a distance, absorbing the small details, the way the independent hauler checked his paperwork carefully, the way he spoke to his helper with a tone that mixed urgency and camaraderie. He felt a strange mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. It took nerve to step into a field that others considered spoken for. It also took a certain amount of stubbornness, the kind that could lead to serious trouble if not carefully redirected. That same season, whispers reached him from the union hall. Some workers said that the independents treated their men well, that they paid on time, that they pushed back against certain expectations about who they should hire and which routes they should avoid. Others muttered that the independents were risking more than they realized. They were not playing by the unwritten rules that had kept things relatively calm for decades. The words racketeering and conspiracy were not part of the coffee break talk. Those were courtroom words, suited to paper and long arguments. On the ground, the language was simpler. Respect, territory, peace. Still, the larger vocabulary was starting to intrude. One afternoon, Salvatore sat in a small office with a calendar on the wall and a stack of invoices on the desk. A lawyer from the city, younger than most of the drivers and full of brisk concern, had asked for a meeting about the growing attention on the industry. The lawyer spoke in careful clinical terms about federal interest, possible investigations, and the phrases that were being quietly rehearsed in government conference rooms. Antitrust, organized crime, private sanitation cartel. To Salvatore, the words felt like someone trying to explain a neighborhood argument using a foreign language. He understood all the terms. He did not entirely accept the way they were strung together. The lawyer mentioned that there were people, including some independent haulers, who were willing to testify in civil suits about how the system worked. Names appeared in the conversation. When the surnames Quebecer and Barstow came up, the lawyer watched Salvatore closely. looking for a reaction. Salvatore gave him nothing dramatic, just a slow nod, as if he were hearing the names for the first time and filing them away as figures in a puzzle. In truth, he now recognized those names as pieces of a story that was growing more complicated than his old map could easily capture. The weeks that followed brought more small signs. A plain car parked near a yard longer than usual, 2 men inside pretending to read newspapers, a driver complaining that someone had followed his truck more than once on a route through an industrial area. At the way stations and landfills, inspectors seemed more alert, more interested in paperwork. They asked extra questions about ownership and routes. They flipped through manifests with exaggerated care, making notes that would they sit in files labelled with the case captions that later showed up in court databases. Salvatore found himself being more cautious without fully admitting it, even to himself. He avoided certain social clubs on nights when he knew certain people would be there. He kept some conversations shorter. He chose his words with greater care when discussing problem accounts. One day he arrived at a landfill entrance to find a line of trucks waiting longer than usual. At the gate, a small group of men in windbreakers spoke with the staff while clipboards and identification badges flashed. The word was that some federal people were touring the facilities, asking about who dumped where, when, and how often. He stood by his car, hands in his pockets, and watched the scene. He looked like any middle-aged man checking on a company operation. No one paid special attention to him. He liked it that way. A driver he knew, an older fellow with a crooked cap and a quick tongue, shuffled up beside him and whispered that the suits were probably counting banana peels. Salvatore responded that maybe they were just lost and looking for a better assignment. They exchanged a chucker that did more to steady the driver than it did to ease Salvatore's own unrest. Later, as he drove back along the highway, he noticed how certain cars seemed to linger in his mirrors. It might have been his imagination, or it might not. Years in the business had sharpened his sense for patterns. Something in the flow felt less natural. The independent names kept surfacing. He heard that Kubeka and Barstow were pushing on legal fronts, not just on the streets. They were said to be giving statements, filing suits, challenging the way routes and customers were divided. They were described, depending on who was speaking, as troublemakers, reformers, idealists, or simply stubborn men who did not know when to stop. In a meeting with a few trusted associates, held in a back room where the light was dim and the coffee strong, their names came up again. The tone was more serious. One man expressed frustration that these independents did not understand the balance they were disturbing. He spoke about years of quiet order, about how everyone had eaten from the same table without overturning it. Now, he said, outsiders were shaking the legs, and the whole thing might collapse. Another suggested that maybe the table needed reinforcing in different ways, that times changed and they had to adjust. Salvatore listened, saying little. When they finally addressed him directly, asking what he thought about the independence and the legal challenges, he answered with a steady voice. He said that ignoring them entirely was not an option, nor was letting panic drive the response. The more attention they attracted by reacting rashly, the more interesting they would look to federal eyes. He proposed the usual measured steps: understand their routes, know their customers, learn how they operated. Information first, everything else later. He did not say what he feared, that these men might not back down just because pressure was applied, that they might wake up every day with the same stubborn purpose, despite visits and conversations and subtle inconveniences. At the union hall, the talk about the independents became a regular background noise. Some workers wondered if they should jump ship. Others pledged loyalty to their long-standing employers. The leadership tried to keep everyone focused on wages, benefits, and safety rules. Salvatore moved among them, listening, offering small reassurances without making promises he could not keep. He told the younger men that the industry had faced pressures before and survived. He told the older men that nothing lasted forever, but that did not mean every change had to end in disaster. Deep down, though, he knew things had shifted. One evening he drove out near a way station just as the sun was starting to sink, casting long shadows over the concrete and steel. The line of trucks was shorter than during the day. He parked in a spot where he could see the approach road and the scale house. A familiar independent truck rolled up. He recognized it now by sound and silhouette. The driver stepped out to speak with an attendant. From where Salvatore sat, the scene had a quiet, almost theatrical quality. The two men were framed by the fading light and the rough geometry of the facility. A distant bird called, a horn sounded somewhere beyond a hill. He watched, not as a strategist, but as a man aware that history sometimes turns on moments that no one recognizes at the time. An independent hauler handing over paperwork, a worker ticking a box. Somewhere else, a clerk filing a complaint, a regulator reading a report, an agent circling a few names on a memo. Echoes, he thought, starting at a way station and travelling farther than anyone in that twilight could see. He did not stay long. He drove away before anyone looked in his direction. As he merged back onto the highway, he considered how small adjustments in a system could ripple outward until the whole arrangement shook. At home that night, his wife asked why he seemed distracted. He replied that the routes were getting more complicated, that there were new players in the game. She said that there were always new players in every field, and that perhaps it was just progress. He smiled faintly and agreed with her, because sometimes it was easier to accept that word than to explain why this kind of progress felt less like smooth evolution and more like a fault line beneath a familiar street. In bed, listening to the distant hum of trucks on the expressway, he tried to imagine a future in which the industry was fully open, prices driven down, routes contested freely. He saw chaos, missed pickups, angry customers. But he also saw something else, something he could not quite name, a world in which men like him were no longer needed to hold the map in their heads. The thought unsettled him more than the idea of investigations. It was one thing to be judged, it was another to be made obsolete. As he drifted towards sleep, the trucks in his memory lined up at the scale house like figures in a quiet procession, waiting to be weighed not only for their loads but for all the unseen history they carried. Chapter 4. The Strain of Silence. The phone calls from Brooklyn came more often as the 80s wore on. They arrived at awkward times as if trouble had its own sense of timing. Early mornings when the house was still sleepy. Late evenings when the dishes were done and the television glow framed his family in a warm square of distraction. The voice on the other end was not always the same, but the tone was familiar. Calm, measured, with a certain weight behind the simple words. Senior figures in the family rarely raised their voices. They did not have to. Sometimes it was a trusted intermediary relaying concerns from Anthony Corallo or from other senior men who had a stake in the waste business. Sometimes it was someone closer to the top, speaking with the smooth assurance of a person used to being obeyed. They wanted updates. What was happening with the independents? How many accounts had drifted? Which union figures were steady and which were suddenly too friendly with outsiders, or with lawyers with government contacts? Salvatore answered carefully. He had always been cautious with his words, and now that habit became a survival tool. He reported facts, not guesses. Where there was uncertainty, he said so. That honesty made him more valuable, but it also pulled him deeper into the center of the storm. Mornings after such calls, he would stand at the front window of his Suffolk house and watch his children heading off to school, backpacks bouncing, voices lively. From that perspective, the words conspiracy and racketeering sounded like names of far-off storms on someone else's weather report. Yet he knew they were gathering over his own horizon. At the breakfast table, his wife picked up on the tension without knowing all its details. She sensed it in the way he checked the clock more often, in the way he folded the newspaper with sharper creases. She asked, gently, if business was getting rough. He responded in generalities: competition, regulations, the usual headaches. She accepted the answer because there was little else she could do. They both understood the boundaries. Family dinners became a kind of fragile truce between his two lives. The table was set with care. The food was simple and comforting. His children talked about teachers, friends, and small grievances that felt enormous to them and adorably minor to him. He listened, nodded, and laughed in the right places. Inside, part of him floated somewhere above the room, watching as if it were an exhibit in a museum called Ordinary Family Life, When the phone rang during these dinners, and it did more often than most households would tolerate, he would excuse himself with a muttered apology. "It might be work," he would say. In the small hallway by the kitchen, he would answer. The voices from Brooklyn brought the other world into that domestic space, their questions and expectations threading through the floral wallpaper and family photographs. They wanted assurance that the pressure from independents like Quebecer and Barstow would be managed. They worried about emboldened customers and about union men who smelled change and opportunity. Some callers hinted that stronger measures might be needed. Their language stayed coded, but the meaning hung behind the syllables. They spoke of making examples, of sending messages, of restoring respect. Salvatore felt the strain of those conversations like a knot in his chest. He understood their concern. He also understood, more keenly than some of his higher-ups, just how closely federal eyes were watching now. He had seen the plain sedans near landfills, the extra inspectors at transfer stations, the way city and county officials suddenly insisted on following every rule with almost religious zeal. Each time someone suggested a harsher approach to the independents, he imagined not just the immediate consequences, but the long tail of legal trouble that would follow. Federal agents would not ignore dramatic gestures. They would treat them as invitations. So he tried to steer the callers back toward patience. He spoke of long-game strategies, financial pressure, competitive pricing in selected areas, quiet conversations with suppliers and bankers, all the subtle levers that could be pulled without creating headlines. His interlocutors listened, but they did not always sound convinced. The old instinct in that world leaned towards swift, decisive action. After hanging up, he would pause in the empty hallway, resting his hand on the receiver as if it were still warm. He took a breath, then returned to the dining room. The children might be trading jokes or arguing over the last piece of bread. His wife would follow him with her eyes, measuring his expression. Sometimes, when conversation lulled, the television in the living room would spill out a crime story from the evening news. A narrator would speak in grave tones about investigations into organized crime, about prosecutors vowing to clean up certain industries. If the segment touched on the private carting business, he would feel his stomach tighten. His children rarely paid attention. To them, the news was just background noise. His wife, however, watched his reaction. Once, an anchor mentioned his name among a list of figures allegedly linked to a racketeering case. The pronunciation was slightly off, but close enough. His youngest child asked, with the cheerful bluntness of youth, if that man on the screen was related to them. For a moment the room held its breath. His wife looked at him. He answered calmly that there were many people with that surname in the region, and that the television liked dramatic stories. Then he turned the channel to a harmless game show. The children lost interest after a few moments and drifted back to their own concerns. Later that night, in bed, his wife asked in a quiet voice if they should be worried. He chose his words with care. He said that officials were making lists and that his name might appear on some of them. He said that he would deal with whatever came, that he would keep them as safe as he could. She accepted this, because she trusted him, and because there was no alternative plan. They had built their lives on the foundation of his income, his connections, and his judgment. Changing that structure now would have been like trying to move a house without disturbing the furniture. The strain did not show itself in shouting matches or public scenes. It lived in the spaces between words, in the nights when he lay awake listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant thrum of highway traffic. He thought of men like Quebecer and Barstow, who had, according to rumour, talked to lawyers and officials about how the system worked. He wondered if they slept soundly, or if they too stared at ceilings, weighed down by heavy decisions. He could not paint them as simple villains or heroes in his mind. They were competitors, yes. They were, from his side of the fence, destabilizing forces, but they were also men with families, with their own sense of what was right. In rare, unguarded moments, he admitted to himself that it took a certain courage to stand up to a structure as entrenched as the one that governed the carting routes. That courage might seem foolish from his perspective, but it was courage nonetheless. In the meetings with his own people, however, he could not allow such nuance to show. When he sat down with representatives of the family in quiet Brooklyn rooms, the talk was brisk. The independents, he was told, will make too much noise. The unions were under pressure. Law enforcement was sniffing around. Something had to give. They asked for assessments. Would the independents back down under economic pressure alone? Would the legal challenges they were involved in produce real damage? Salvatore answered that the legal cases were dangerous not just because of potential verdicts, but because they invited attention. Every document filed, every witness statement, was a thread that investigators could follow. He recommended strategies that involved negotiation where possible, offer certain customers slightly better terms to keep them from jumping, work with union leaders to steady their people with assurances about pension contributions and benefits, present a united front of normalcy. In the back of those rooms, the older men listened, weighing his words. Some of them looked tired, their power now as much about reputation as about day-to-day control. They had built lives on firm roots and quiet arrangements. The possibility that the ground itself might be shifting made them deeply uneasy. Now and then someone implied that examples might be necessary. They did not specify what kind, they rarely needed to. The idea hung in the air like the faint smell of smoke after a match had been struck and blown out. Salvatore did what he could to delay such thinking, to turn conversations back towards subtle pressure and patient strategy. But he could feel the mood hardening. People who had spent decades maintaining quiet order did not adjust gracefully to being challenged in courts and newspapers. At home, the silence grew heavier. His wife stopped asking certain questions because she sensed that the answers would not help her sleep. His children grew into teenagers, then young adults, each with their own opinions about authority and fairness. They spoke about politics, about corruption in distant offices, about the need to clean up various institutions. Sometimes the private carting industry appeared in those discussions, framed by the media as an example of entrenched corruption. He listened without interrupting, feeling the odd dislocation of a man hearing his own story told back to him in simplified terms, with himself cast as some of the shadows at the edge of the frame. He wanted at times to explain that the world was not as cleanly divided into good and bad as the headlines suggested, that the routes he managed had provided steady work and predictable service to countless people, even if the methods of maintaining them were flawed. But he knew that any such speech would sound like justification, so he kept his thoughts to himself and let his children vent their righteous frustrations at the television, the newspaper, and abstract figures they would never meet. In the quiet of his own mind, the strain grew into a constant background hum. He felt pulled between competing loyalties. To the men above him, who expected him to maintain order in a profitable corner of the world, to the workers and customers who depended on stability, to his own family who deserved a life as free as possible from scandal and danger. And then there was the final loyalty, the one he had long kept at arm's length, loyalty to his own sense of what was decent. He had always told himself a story in which his actions, while not spotless, served a greater good of maintaining peace. Now, as talk of more drastic responses to the independents increased, that story became harder to sustain. On sleepless nights, he walked softly through his dark house, careful not to wake anyone. He stood at the front window and stared out at the quiet street. The garbage cans lined up at the curb looked innocent, almost childlike, in the sodium streetlight. In those moments, he imagined futures branching out from the choices being discussed in smoky rooms. In some futures, cooler heads prevailed and the industry adapted, accepting legal changes and competing in a new, more open way. In others, hotter passions ruled, leading to actions that could not be taken back. He felt himself standing at a crossroads where every path involved loss. If he pushed too hard for moderation, he risked being seen as weak, even disloyal. If he went along with harsher measures, he knew he would cross a line inside himself, regardless of what any court might eventually say. Yet the system he served did not recognize such internal lines. It only measured results, routes held, prices maintained, challenges suppressed. The silence of his house in those hours weighed more heavily than any shouted argument could have. There was Noden to explain himself to but the quiet. He thought of the weighing scales at the landfills, that steady beam measuring the mass of each truck. In some private corner of his mind, he pictured a similar scale for human choices, for the balance between loyalty and conscience. The needle, he felt, was starting to tremble. Chapter 5. The Summer When Everything Changed. The heat settled over Long Island like a heavy blanket that summer, a slow pressing warmth that lingered even after the sun went down. On some afternoons the air above the blacktop shimmered, and the smell of hot tar mixed with the usual odours from dumpsters and loading docks. For men in the waste business, summer had its own rhythm. Restaurants overflowed, beach crowds left overflowing cans by the boardwalk, ice cream shops burned through paper cups and napkins. Trash weight went up, tempers rose with it, and trucks worked harder. Salvatore moved through those days with the practiced calm of someone who had seen many summers come and go. Yet underneath his steady exterior, something felt different, like a faint vibration under the surface of the road. He noticed it first in the way people watched each other. At the transfer stations, drivers took longer looks at unfamiliar trucks. At union meetings, conversations dropped to a murmur when certain names came up. In coffee shops near the yards, there were more quiet huddles in corners. The independent haulers, including the ones with the surnames that had started to echo through his life, kept running their routes. Their trucks rolled along streets that the old arrangement had long considered settled. They did not seem afraid, at least not from a distance. Rumours moved faster than any truck. Some said the independents were working closely with lawyers, building cases, collecting stories from customers and drivers about intimidation. Others claimed they were cooperating with government people, describing the private carting system in careful detail. Salvatore listened to these stories and sifted them the way he would sift through route reports. Some details rang true, others felt exaggerated. The one fact he could not ignore was that federal interest was now a constant presence, the way humidity hung in the air. One particularly hot afternoon, he drove through East Northport with his window cracked just enough to let in some breeze. The town was full of small stores and low-brick buildings that looked almost sleepy in the light. Children rode bikes in loose groups. Sprinklers hissed over patchy lawns. He passed a small commercial strip that he knew well. Years earlier, every account there had been settled in quiet conversations. Now, one of the dumpsters bore a logo he did not recognize, a modest design that belonged to one of the independents. He slowed only slightly, letting his eyes take in the scene without turning his head too much. A helper from the new company was sliding a container back into place, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. For a moment, Salvatore imagined walking over, introducing himself, asking how the summer was treating them. He could picture the conversation as one professional to another, talking about fuel costs and long days, leaving unspoken all the other layers that hung around those metal bins. Instead, he drove on. Some meetings, he knew, were better left to others. Toward the middle of that summer, word reached him that there would be a small gathering down by the water one evening. It was presented as a casual get-together, a chance for a few men to breathe air that did not pass through a diesel engine first. He arrived near dusk. The spot was an unremarkable stretch of shoreline where the bay lapped quietly at a rocky edge. The sky above the water was a faded blue, streaked with pale orange where the sun had dipped. A few cars were parked in an uneven row. Men stood in small groups, their silhouettes outlined against the remaining light. The breeze coming off the water was cooler than the heavy air inland. It carried the faint scent of salt and seaweed, a welcome break from the usual smells of his trade. He joined the group that mattered, with a nod that served as greeting and acknowledgement. There were men there whose names appeared in newspapers, though rarely spelled correctly. Others were known only in certain circles, respected for their ability to keep problems from becoming headlines. The conversation started, as it often did, with ordinary remarks. The heat, the ball teams, complaints about traffic on the expressway. Men laughed softly, their voices blending with the gentle slap of water against stones. Then the talk turned, almost without anyone noticing exactly when, toward the independents and the sense that the old order was under open challenge. Someone mentioned the latest stories about legal actions, about how certain independent haulers were cooperating in civil suits that laid out, in painstaking detail, the ways routes had been controlled for decades. Names were spoken. including the ones that now carried weight. The men in their trucks, the lawyers in their suits, the agents in their windbreakers. One older figure asked the question that had been hovering: how far were they prepared to let these independent voices go? Was there a line beyond which patience turned into something else? The answers were not given directly, they rarely were. Instead, suggestions floated. There was talk of strengthening pressure, making life more difficult in practical ways, reminding certain people that peace had conditions. Salvatore listened, feeling the familiar push and pull inside himself. On the hand, he understood the logic of reasserting control. The system had survived this long because challenges were met firmly before they spread. Letting too many independents carve off pieces of the map would eventually make the whole picture unrecognizable. On the other hand, he could not ignore the new reality. Every strong gesture now carried greater risk. Federal investigators were paying close attention to the private sanitation world. Any act that looked like retaliation could light up their radar like a flare. He spoke up when the motion in the conversation seemed to lean too far toward hard talk. His voice remained calm and even. He reminded the others that headlines were no longer just ink. They led to wiretaps, surveillance, undercover operations. He pointed out that the independents already seemed ready to stand in court and talk. If they suddenly faced more dramatic trouble, every prosecutor in the region would want to know why. There was a pause after he spoke. Men looked away toward the water, each measuring the cost of restraint against the satisfactions of decisive action. One of the senior figures finally nodded and murmured that he had a point. No one openly promised anything, but the drift of the talk shifted slightly, back towards strategies that involved pressure without overt spectacle. The sun disappeared entirely while their voices rose and fell. When the meeting broke up, the sky was dark, and the water reflected only thin lines of light from distant houses. Salvatore stood for a moment by himself, watching the bay. In the dark surface he imagined all the things that could sink without a trace and all the things that could not. He drove home slowly that night, the road nearly empty. His headlights traced familiar curves. The radio played soft old songs that barely reached his attention. His mind stayed with that shoreline, with the faces half lit by fading day, with the unsaid sentences that hung between their chosen words. Summer pressed on. Near the end of the season the weather broke for a few days. Rain swept through, washing dust off the streets and leaving puddles in the ruts behind the yards. The air felt lighter, but the mood in the industry did not. One evening, as he sat alone in his car outside a small office, the wipers ticking slowly back and forth, he turned on the radio to pass a few minutes before a meeting. The announcer spoke in a routine cadence about traffic, local politics, a minor celebrity scandal. Then the voice changed. It took on that careful, serious tone that told listeners something heavier was coming. There had been, the announcer said, a violent event at the office of a private carting company in Suffolk County. 2 men were reported unalived. Their names were given. They were names that had been on Salvatore's mind for months, the stubborn independent haulers. He sat very still, his hands resting on the steering wheel. Outside, rain drummed on the roof and blurred the view through the windshield. Inside the car, the words from the radio seemed oddly distant, as if they were being broadcast from a different world. Details were scarce in that first report. There were mentions of police, of shock in the local business community, of neighbors describing the sound of shots. The announcer used phrases like execution style and organized crime ties. The language felt cold and impersonal, fitting those men into slots in a story model that had been used many times before. The report moved on. Sports. Weather. A song. Salvatore turned off the radio and sat in silence. The only sound was the rain and the slow rhythm of the wipers. His reflection in the windshield looked pale and older than he felt. He did not cheer or curse. He did not speak to the empty car. He simply let the reality settle in. A line had been crossed. The kind of line that did not fade, even when people tried to step over it and keep moving. He thought of the way station where he had watched the independent truck roll onto the scale. He thought of the small office where those men had likely mapped their own routes and worried their own worries. He thought of families who would now be sitting in shock, of workers who would wonder if they should even show up the next day. In his own world, explanations would be offered in careful language. Some would say that examples had to be made. Others would insist that things had gone too far, that such an outcome would invite exactly the kind of federal attention they had tried to avoid. He knew already that investigators would swarm this case. The combination of independent haulers, prior legal disputes, and whispers about the cartel would be irresistible to prosecutors. In the days that followed, news stories multiplied. Newspapers ran photos of the crime scene, of officers behind barricade tape, of grieving relatives. They reran older articles about the civil suits and about the structure of the private sanitation industry. Experts appeared on television to explain how mob influence worked. Salvatore read and watched these reports with a detached expression, but inside something cold had settled. He could not claim surprise. The possibility had hung in the air at every tense meeting that summer. The decision, when it came, had been made somewhere above his exact line of command, or beside it, or perhaps with his own cautious objections included and disregarded. Yet he also could not deny a sense of personal responsibility. The system he had helped maintain, with its quiet rules and informal pressures, had always contained the seed of this kind of outcome. He had spent years telling himself that such extremes were rare, that his role was mostly about keeping things from reaching this point. Now the distance he had tried to preserve between himself and the darkest possibilities shrank. At home, the story dominated the news for a while. His family watched the coverage at the dinner table. His children reacted with shock and anger. His wife watched him closely. When his name appeared in none of the longer newspaper pieces, described as a high-ranking figure in the waste cartel, his wife folded the paper carefully and set it aside. They did not discuss that paragraph aloud. In quiet moments, he imagined alternative summers. In Nen, the independents backed down under pressure and found other lines of work. In another, the industry found a way to absorb them, to recognize their stubbornness as energy to be channeled rather than crushed. The summer he actually lived through had chosen a harsher path. The consequences of that choice would unfold across courtrooms and cells for years. For the moment, all he could do was move through each day with his usual deliberate calm, even as he felt the ground under his feet shifting. The trucks still rolled, routes were still run, trash was still collected and buried, but the air had changed. The engines now roared against a different kind of silence, the kind that comes after something sharp has broken the surface of the water. Chapter 6. Indictments in the Morning Mail. The envelope that marked the start of the next phase of his life did not look dramatic. It arrived in the usual way, slipped through the slot with the ordinary mail and landing on the hallway rug among store flyers and utility bills. His wife picked up the stack and sorted it at the kitchen counter. She paused when she reached the heavy one, turning it in her hands, reading the return address. Her eyes tightened just enough to show that she understood this was not news from a cousin or an insurance company. She placed it on the table and called his name. There was a small hesitation in her voice, as if she were trying not to give the object more power than it already had. He came in from the yard, wiped his hands on a towel, and saw the envelope. The print on it came from a different world, United States, District Court, Eastern. The words sat there, very calm and official, like a judgment already reached. For a second he thought of leaving it sealed, as if the paper could delay whatever waited inside. Then the practical part of him took over. Problems did not shrink when ignored, they grew teeth. He slid a finger under the flap and opened it with a steady motion. Inside was a stack of pages dense with text. His name appeared in the first paragraph, linked with a string of charges that seemed to stretch on: racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, mail fraud. The document laid out the government's view of his life as if it were a simple story. Routes controlled by illegal means, competitors pressured, customers deprived of fair competition. The words private sanitation cartel repeated more than once. He read slowly, line by line, as if navigating a dangerous road in thick fog. Each page described scenes he recognized but did not fully accept in the way they were framed. Agreements that he had seen as pragmatic arrangements were recast as criminal acts. Relationships he understood as mutual obligations were described as fear-based control. His wife sat across from him, hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not interrupt. When he reached the end, he placed the pages back on the table, squared them with unnecessary care, and said quietly that they would need a good lawyer. There was also a separate notice tucked in the packet, a summons to appear, a date and time when his path would cross officially with the government's. No more rumours or television mentions. This was the formal beginning. News of his indictment reached others almost as quickly as it had reached his mailbox. Phones rang in yards and union halls. Men shook their heads, some with sympathy, some with caution. A few with thinly hidden satisfaction that attention had moved from their own names to his. In the days that followed, he met with attorneys in conference rooms that all seemed to have the same bland artwork on the walls and the same carafe of lukewarm coffee in the centre of the table. The lawyers spoke a fast, precise language. They referred to cases with long titles. They explained possible sentencing guidelines, plea options, the strength of evidence based on witnesses and paper trails. They had read the civil cases about the private sanitation industry, including the ones where independent haulers and customers had laid out their experiences in depositions. They had copies of transcripts where men like Quebecer and Barstow described threats and pressures, now frozen forever in the neutral type of court reporting. Salvatore listened, absorbing the information like a driver taking in road signs. Part of him felt strangely detached, as if they were discussing someone else. Another part recorded every detail with the same careful attention he had once given to route schedules. The lawyers wanted to know his side of the story. He understood that this did not mean a confession of sins. It meant facts that could be used to challenge the government's version, or at least to soften it. He told them about the history of the waste business, about how routes had been stable for decades, about the way unions, companies and families had developed a network of understandings. He described his role as administrator, mediator, organizer. When they asked directly about pressure on independence, his answer became more cautious. He acknowledged that there had been confrontations, that certain people had been encouraged not to disrupt established arrangements. He avoided painting any picture that involved explicit threats. One attorney pointed out that the government did not need direct recordings of threats to convince a jury. Patterns of behaviour, economic pressure, and witness testimony could be enough. They discussed the names of co-defendants. Some he knew well, others were distant figures whose roles had never intersected much with his daily work. The indictment linked them all in a chain of alleged conspiracies. Outside the conference rooms, life went on. He still took out the trash in the morning, he still greeted neighbours. But now, every trip to the mailbox carried a small jolt of anticipation. Every unknown car on the street looked, just for a moment, like government surveillance. On the day he was first required to appear in court, he dressed with care. A simple suit, nothing flashy, nothing that looked like defiance or surrender. His wife rode with him to the city in the passenger seat, a reversal of the many drives he had taken in years past with other men beside him. Traffic into Brooklyn was as stubborn as ever. Buses lumbered, cabs darted, pedestrians crossed against lights with the casual bravery of long-time city dwellers. He drove in silence, hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on his leg. As they approached the courthouse, he noticed the building's solid lines, its steps worn by countless feet. He had lived most of his life with this structure existing somewhere in the background, a place other people entered on official business. Now it was part of his route. Reporters clustered near the entrance, microphones and cameras ready. Officers guided the flow of people through metal detectors. Lawyers in suits hurried up and down the stairs. For a moment he sat in the parked car and watched the scene. The courthouse had, in a strange way, its own version of yard life. People lined up, checked in, were sorted into rooms. Instead of trucks bearing loads, there were defendants carrying their own histories. Instead of weigh scales, there were judges and juries. He stepped out into the noise. A reporter called his name, asking for comment on the charges, on the alleged control of the carting industry, on the accusations tied to violence in Suffolk County. He did not answer. His attorney had been clear. Let the legal filings speak. Anything said on the steps would be chopped into sound bites and played back without context. Inside, the air was cooler. The security check was routine, pockets emptied, belt removed, items passed through a scanner. For a man who had spent his life minimizing his official footprint, the feel of fluorescent light and government tiles was unsettling. They found the courtroom where his case would be heard, one room among many. It had wooden benches, a raised bench for the judge, and the familiar layout anyone who has watched a courtroom drama would recognize. The difference was that this time, the drama was his. As the proceedings began, he shared space at the defense table with other men whose names had appeared beside his in the indictment. Some nodded to him in brief acknowledgement. Others kept their eyes forward. Everyone had their own calculations, their own fears, their own strategies. The prosecutor read through the charges in a steady voice, outlining the alleged scheme, how routes had been assigned, how competitors had been pushed, how customers had been encouraged or discouraged in their choices. Charts and diagrams were mentioned, showing links between companies, unions, and individuals. Hearing his life described in this careful, accusing narrative was like listening to a stranger summarize his biography using only the harshest details. When it was his turn to enter a plea, he rose with the others and spoke the expected words, "Note guilty." 3 simple syllables standing between him and the story the government wanted to tell. The judge set schedules for future motions and hearings. Lawyers on both sides used terms that would have sounded like another language to many of the drivers and helpers who still rolled down Long Island streets every morning. Afterward, he exited into the afternoon light. Cameras followed. Questions were thrown again. He kept his gaze level and his mouth closed. His attorney fielded what needed answering. On the drive home, his wife sat quietly. The city receded in the rearview mirror, bridges and signs slid past. He felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with age or heat. Back in Suffolk County, the rhythms of the waste business continued in the background. Trucks still lined up at waste stations, Union Hall still served coffee. But now the industry moved under the shadow of ongoing cases. There were also civil suits brought by customers and independent haulers naming him and others as participants in a long-running arrangement that had allegedly cost them money and freedom of choice. The language in those complaints echoed the criminal charges, but with a different focus. Damages, restitution, monetary responsibility. In yet more conference rooms, he sat with another set of attorneys who explained how these civil cases might play out. Settlements, consent decrees, the possibility of court orders reshaping the industry itself. He thought of his old map, now long gone, and imagined judges and regulators drawing their own lines across the same streets, deciding which firms could bid where, under what rules. Occasionally, during breaks from these legal discussions, he would step outside and walk a block or two. The city sounds wrapped around him, horns, footsteps, snatches of conversation. On one such walk, he passed a commercial block where a truck from a major corporate hauler was making a pickup. The truck was shiny, its logo modern and confident. The crew wore matching uniforms with reflective stripes. A tablet computer sat on the dashboard. He watched them for a few moments. The men worked quickly, efficiently, under the eye of regulations and company policies rather than the invisible lines he had once helped draw. In that moment, he had a strange sense of having stepped out of his own time. The battles that now consumed his days in court were in some ways already decided on the streets. The future of the industry had been claimed by larger forces, by corporate consolidation and stricter oversight, by public awareness and legal scrutiny. What remained for him personally was to navigate the consequences of the past. Back at home, the mail continued to arrive. Some days brought more legal notices. Some brought small kindnesses. A card from a relative, a note from an old driver thanking him for past help in a difficult moment. He kept those kind notes in a separate drawer, a quiet counterweight to the heavy official packets. At night, when the house was still, he sometimes thought about the phrase United States v. Avellino. It was a tidy way to name a case. The largest entity he could imagine on one side, himself, one man on the other. He understood, logically, that the reality was more complex. The case involved many people, many events, many decisions spread across years and miles. Yet the caption stayed in his mind like a simple, stark headline. He had once believed that he understood every route, every account, every quiet agreement that mattered in his worlds. Now he was learning that there were other maps, drawn in offices he had never visited, with his name marked in ink he could not erase. The truck still rumbled in the distance, at dawn. He still rose to make coffee and read the paper, but the morning mail had become something else entirely. A daily reminder that the system he had served was now being weighed, counted, and judged by a different scale. Chapter 7. Inside Time. The first door closed behind him with a sound he knew he would remember for the rest of his life. It was not a sharp slam, more a heavy mechanical sigh, metal settling into metal. Another door waited ahead, and another after that. Each one marked a step away from the world he had spent decades moving through and into a world that ran on different rules. The intake process began with paperwork. That part almost comforted him. Forms had always been part of his life. Contracts, invoices, union reports, notes from lawyers. Now the forms had a different letterhead. United States Bureau of Prisons. A clerk read out his name, his date of birth, his register number. There was something oddly polite in the way the clerk did it, as if they were checking him into a hotel instead of a federal facility. They took his belt, his watch, the small objects that had travelled with him for years. Each item was placed in a bag and labelled. He watched his life shrink into a handful of tagged belongings. He changed into prison clothes in a small room where the walls were attired off-white. The fabric felt stiff and unfamiliar. His reflection in a thin mirror looked like a stranger playing a role. The posture was still his, the eyes still dark and alert, but the clothes told another story. A guard led him down a corridor lit by harsh fluorescent lights. The air smelled of disinfectant and something less definable, a mix of old sweat, institutional food, and time. Doors lined the hallway, each with a narrow window. Voices floated from some of them, muted and indistinct. They showed him his cell. It was small but not surprising. A bed bolted to the wall, a metal sink and toilet, a shelf for a few books, a barred window high up that let in a slice of sky. The door closed with that same resigned metal sound. For the first time in many years, he was no longer the man who directed routes and meetings. He was an inmate, one of many, subject to schedules and counts set by others. The weight of that shift settled on him slowly, like dust accumulating on a forgotten surface. His first days inside were a blur of orientation. He learned the routines. Wake up when the lights came on, stand for count, hands visible, move in line to the dining hall, where trays slid across a metal rail, go to assigned areas for work or recreation, return when told. He discovered that time here had its own texture. It could be heavy and still whir moment, then suddenly sliced into pieces by whistles, announcements, and keys rattling at doors. On the yard he found the track, a simple loop of packed ground worn down by countless shoes. Men walked its circle in pairs or small groups, some talking quietly, some lost in their own thoughts. He joined them, taking one measured step after another. At first he walked alone, content to listen. Fragments of conversation drifted past him, stories about cases, about appeals, about lives on the outside, complaints about food, about staff, about the unfairness of everything, jokes about age, about aches, about how slow the mail could be. In time he fell into a steady rhythm with a few other older inmates. They were men with grey hair, lined faces, and the kind of calm that comes after you realise shouting does not change much. One had been in the union world. Another had done time for financial schemes that would have bored most of the drivers Salvatore used to manage. They talked about weather, about sports, about the food, about their grandchildren. They rarely asked each other for detailed stories about what had brought them there. If a man volunteered some of his history, the others listened without judgment. It was as if each understood that everyone here carried a heavy file somewhere in a cabinet, and that file spoke loudly enough. When they did talk about their cases, they used general terms. My situation. My thing. They complained about prosecutors, about judges, about laws that had changed over the years. They shook their heads at sentencing guidelines that stacked years like bags of trash on a cart. Salvatore found a strange comfort in these walks. He could not control the route here. The track was a fixed loop. but the regularity of it reminded him of the old days mapping streets. One lap, then another, then another. You measured progress in circuits, not miles. Work assignments came next. He was given a job in a part of the facility where he helped with simple tasks, sorting supplies and moving them where they needed to go. It was not glamorous, but it filled hours and kept his hands busy. He approached the job the way he had approached most things in life, methodically. There were tasks to be done, sequences to follow, small efficiencies to find. The staff noticed. In a place where many men dragged their feet, someone who worked steadily and without attitude stood out. Some staff members were curt, some were indifferent, a few were quietly respectful. They had seen many kinds of men pass through. Some came in loud and angry, some came in bewildered. The quiet ones, the ones who followed the routine and did not make trouble, were easier to deal with. He did not look for favors, he knew better than that. The system here was rigid, and trying to bend it openly rarely ended well. Instead, he aimed for a kind of low-profile reliability. From time to time, newspapers made their way inside. He read them when he could, scanning for news about the outside world and about the cases connected to his own. He saw articles about consent decrees reshaping the private sanitation industry, about new regulations, about major corporate haulers buying up smaller firms. The old world of small yards and quiet arrangements was being absorbed into something larger, more faceless, more heavily supervised. He read names he knew. Some were co-defendants facing their own trials and sentences. Others were former allies who had chosen different paths, some of them cooperating with authorities. The papers also mentioned civil judgments in cases tied to the waste business. Customers and independent haulers were winning damages. The phrase private sanitation cartel appeared again and again, as if it had become a standard label. In the television room, news anchors discussed organized crime crackdowns in various cities. Sometimes his own case was mentioned briefly, part of a wider effort to clean up certain industries. His name would appear on the screen for a few seconds, then vanish as the story moved on to other things. Other inmates glanced at him when that happened. Most already knew who he was, in general terms. In a place like this, reputations move faster than mail. He did not boast about his past. He did not pretend innocence in every respect. When conversations turned to stories about the outside, he focused on work details, on union politics, on the logistics of moving trash, more than on the darker edges. He told Dunn younger man that if you wanted to understand power, you should watch who controlled the schedules. In his world, the person who decided which truck went where and when had more influence than the loudest tough guy in any bar. The younger man laughed and said that only someone from the waste business would describe life in terms of routes and pickups. Salvatore smiled and said that all systems were routes and pickups in one form or another. You just had to learn what you were really collecting and where it ended up. As months turned into years, he watched the seasons change through narrow windows and fenced yard space. In winter, snow dusted the yard and turned the track into a crunching path. The cold seeped through layers of clothing. Breath came out in puffs of white. The sky often looked like a lid. In spring, patches of grass tried to assert themselves in corners, only to be trampled back into the dirt. A few small trees near the fence grew leaves that trembled in the breeze. They were a reminder that the world still cycled on regardless of how many men were locked away. Summer brought heat that pressed against the walls. The air inside became thick. Tempers sometimes flared more easily then, though among the older men patience usually held. They had learned that outbursts cost more than they gained. Autumn painted the few visible trees in dull reds and browns. Leaves blew into corners of the yard, collected bait until someone swept them up. Time did not move quickly, but it did move. He marked it not only by calendar dates but by small internal milestones. A letter from a grandchild learning to read. News of a marriage in the extended family. A driver he once knew, now retired, sending a note about his own health troubles. He responded to letters with neat handwriting, choosing words carefully. He did not dwell on prison details. Instead, he asked about school, about jobs, about ordinary things. He wanted his family to see him as present, even if the bars between them said otherwise. Visits from his wife were both comfort and burden. She travelled to see him when she could, enduring security checks and long waits in bland rooms. They sat across from each other at small tables under fluorescent lights, surrounded by other families doing the same. They talked about practical matters at first: bills, house repairs, health. Then they ventured into the harder subjects: his case, appeals that might or might not succeed, the lives of their children and grandchildren. She was stronger than he had ever fully appreciated when he was free. The strain of his legal troubles and imprisonment had etched new lines in her face, but there was a steadiness in her gaze that held him together. He apologized more than once, in ways that did not always use that exact word. He said that he was sorry for what his choices had brought on their family. She replied that they had built the life they knew together, and that they would live with the consequences together. After visits, when she left through the doors and he returned to his unit, he felt both heavier and lighter. He carried her concern and her loyalty with him, but he also carried the sharp reminder of what he was missing. Inside, he met men serving sentences much longer than his, some for acts more violent, some for schemes that had moved sums of money he could barely comprehend. He observed how they organized their days, how they carved out routines that gave them structure. One man ran laps around the yard every day, counting them under his breath. Another devoted himself to books, working through long histories and thick novels, using the prison library like a private university. Salvatore found his own balance between motion and reflection. He walked the track, he worked his assignments, he watched the news, he thought. He thought about the past with an honesty that had been harder to reach when he was busy orchestrating routes and meetings. In here he had fewer distractions. The justifications he had used for years began to sound thinner when repeated silently in a small cell. He could no longer tell himself that everything he had done was necessary. He could still see how the system had provided stability in some ways, but he could also see more clearly the cost to those who had dared to challenge it. Men like the independent haulers whose names had haunted his last free summers ceased to be vague rivals and became more solid in his mind. He thought of them not as competitors but as fathers, husbands, workers. Their absence from the world left a different kind of gap than an empty route on a map. He did not arrive at simple conclusions. He knew that pointing back in time and changing decisions was impossible. But he also knew that admitting complexity, even only to himself, was better than hiding behind easy slogans about business and tradition. Near the end of his time inside, the world outside seemed to accelerate. The television reported on new mayors, new city projects, new scandals in industries unrelated to his. There were stories about technology he barely understood: the internet, email, new ways for people to communicate instantly across distances that once would have required a drive and a handshake. He realized that the networks that had once defined his life, built on personal contact and unspoken understandings, were being replaced by networks of wires and screens. It was easier now in many fields to follow the money, to track the routes, to record the conversations. He sometimes wondered how long the old system he had served could really have survived, even without the prosecutions. The world was closing around such arrangements, tightening rules, shining lights into corners that had once stayed comfortably dim. On the day he finally walked out, his belongings were returned to him piece by piece: his watch, his belt. Items that had seemed unimportant when taken now felt like small fragments of self being restored. The outside air smelled different. It was the same mix of exhaust and distant greenery he had known before, but after years inside, every scent was sharper. He stepped through the last door with the tentative gait of a man learning how to measure distance again. His time was not entirely his own. Supervision and restrictions waited, but he was on the outside of the walls, and that alone felt enormous. He glanced back once at the structure that had contained him. It looked solid and indifferent, a place built to hold not bodies but the leftovers of many choices. Then he turned toward the road that would take him home, to a Long Island that had changed while he was gone, and to a world where the routes he once controlled existed now mostly as memories and cautionary tales. Chapter 8: Long Island in Slow Motion. When he returned to Long Island, it was both familiar and strange, like a street seen through a windshield after a heavy rain. The outlines were the same, but the details had shifted, blurred, or sharpened in unexpected ways. The first drive from the facility back towards Suffolk County was quiet. A younger relative sat behind the wheel, hands at 10 and 2, eyes fixed on the road. Salvatore rode in the passenger seat now, a position he once associated with powerful men like Anthony Corallo. The highway rolled out ahead of them, lanes wider than he remembered, signs brighter, traffic patterns altered by years of construction. New sound barriers lined stretches of the route, blocking his view of neighborhoods he used to know by their rooftops and trees. He watched the exit names flash past. Some tugged at old habits. He knew which ones led to yards that no longer existed, to social clubs that had been shuttered, to restaurants where he had held quiet meetings in back rooms. His relative talked in a stream about work, about children, about small worries and plans. He listened, grateful for the normal chatter. The details grounded him more than any official re-entry orientation could. As they approached his old neighborhood, he leaned forward slightly, taking in the small changes. A corner deli had turned into a chain coffee shop. A repair garage now bore a sign for a fitness center. A row of modest houses sported new siding or additions. His own house stood where it always had, a little older, a little more weathered. His wife had kept it up as best she could. The paint on the trim showed fresh strokes in some places, older layers in others. The yard was neat, the shrubs trimmed, the driveway clean. When he stepped out of the car and felt the slight give of his own walkway under his feet, something in his chest loosened. Walls, rules, counts, the clang of metal doors, all of it faded a little as he crossed into his own doorway. Inside, the house smelled of cooking and furniture polish. Familiar objects waited for him. The same framed school pictures on the wall, now joined by later photos of graduations and weddings. A familiar painting above the sofa. The clock in the kitchen that had ticked away so many early mornings. His wife embraced him with a mixture of relief and quiet sorrow. They had both imagined this moment many times. Nothing in imagination prepares you for the feel of it, the weight of a human being returned after years counted out in reports and visiting room schedules. The first days back were a mixture of normal and strange. He slept in his own bed and woke to the ordinary groan of pipes and the soft clink of cups in the kitchen. He moved through rooms that held his history. Yet at every turn he found reminders that time had not waited. Neighbors had moved away or passed on. Children he remembered as toddlers now drove cars and spoke of mortgages. Stores where he had once been greeted by name had become other stores entirely, their new owners unaware of who he had been or what his name had once meant. He walked slowly around the block, reacquainting himself with the geometry of his street. Garbage cans still waited at curbs on collection days, a quiet parade of plastic and metal. But the trucks that came for them were different. One morning he woke early out of habit and stood behind his curtain as a modern front loader rolled down the street. It bore the logo of a large company that had not existed when he first started in the trade. The crew wore bright uniforms with reflective stripes, safety helmets, and gloves that looked new. A small camera was mounted high at the back of the truck, watching the arm as it lifted and dumped each can. The whole process seemed faster, more mechanized, less personal. Where drivers he had known once waved to customers and traded a few words, these men focused on efficiency. The truck stopped, the arm reached, the can tipped, the arm returned, and the vehicle moved on. He felt no resentment, only a kind of quiet amazement. The industry he had known had not simply been cleaned up. It had been absorbed into a wider system of corporate structures and regulatory frameworks. The word cartel still appeared in old articles about his case, but the current world looked more like any other regulated utility. A week after his return, an old associate came to see him. They sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee just as they once had, though the mood was different now. Both men carried the marks of age and of their separate journeys through the legal system. The associate told him about the changes, the big corporations that now dominated routes the way families once had, the complex bidding processes for municipal and commercial contracts, the oversight agencies that monitored pricing and service levels. He spoke about safety trainings and compliance officers, about digital scales and tracking systems. It all sounded to Salvatore like someone describing a more visible, more audited version of an old structure. Yet he knew that what had been informal and hidden in his time was now codified and watched. He asked if anyone still remembered the old names. His visitor shrugged. Some of the older drivers did, those who had started before the final crackdowns and transitions. They spoke of him and others in half-amused, half-wary tones as figures from a rougher era. The younger workers, though, knew those names mostly from news clips in documentaries or from training sessions about ethics and compliance. For them, Salvatore Avellino was less a person and more a lesson about what not to do. He absorbed that calmly. It was not flattering, but it was honest. History often turned people into symbols. On some mornings he rode with his relative on errands that took them past landmarks of his old professional life. Transfer stations had been renovated or shut. Landfills had turned into capped hills with walking paths and signs about environmental restoration. At Wying, former dump site, there was now a park with a smooth green slope and benches facing a small pond. Families sat on blankets. Children ran in the grass. A plaque nearby briefly explained how the land had once been used and how it had been remediated. He read the inscription and pictured the trucks he had once directed to that very spot, bearing loads that smelled nothing like picnics. The transformation felt almost poetic. What had been hidden and unpleasant was now landscaped and presented as a public good. His relative joked that the world was getting better at covering its tracks. Salvatore replied that at least now they planted trees over the old mess. It was hard to be angry at trees. In grocery stores and coffee shops, he watched people toss cups and wrappers into bins marked with clear labels: trash, recyclables, sometimes compost. He overheard conversations about environmental impact, about sustainable practices, about new rules for separating waste. He thought of how in his day, the focus had been almost entirely on economics and control. Customers cared mainly about the price and the reliability of pickup. The wider consequences of where all that waste went were rarely discussed in his presence. Now, ordinary people debated the merits of paper over plastic, of reusable bags, of recycling rates. The cultural lens on his old business had shifted. He did not try to get back into the industry. Conditions of his release would have made that difficult, even if he had wanted to, but desire did not tug at him. He understood that his time in that world was over. Instead, he sought out quieter roles. A neighbour asked if he could help set out cans for a few older residents on the block who had trouble lugging them to the curb. He agreed without hesitation. On collection mornings he moved up and down the street in the half-light, pulling cans from side yards to curbside. His hands knew the weight, the balance, the tilt needed to avoid spilling. He was slower than in his youth, but still steady. The work made him feel useful in a small, honest way. No arrangements, no envelopes, no careful calls to Brooklyn. Just a man helping move containers from one place to another so that someone else could carry them away. Neighbours thanked him, sometimes with a shy wave, sometimes with a small bag of pastries left at his door. Many of them had only a vague notion of his past. They knew he had been away. They knew his name had been in the papers once. But life on a suburban street is often more interested in lawn care and school schedules than in old indictments. He found himself talking more with younger residents, answering their questions about how the neighbourhood used to be. He spoke of old shops and changed intersections, of snowstorms that had buried cars, of blackouts that turned the block into a quiet echo of a much older rural past. When they asked, as they sometimes did, what he had done for a living, he said simply that he had worked in the garbage business and that it had been complicated. That usually satisfied them. Some laughed and said that somebody had to do it. He replied that he had always thought the same. At night, when the house was quiet, he sat by the front window and watched the streetlights cast their cones of brightness. Cars passed now and then, dogs were walked. Somewhere in the distance, on main roads he could not see, trucks still rolled. He listened for them the way some people listen for distant trains, a low hum, a rising whine, the soft hiss of brakes. In the glow of the television he saw new scandals replacing old ones, different industries, different schemes, different names, some younger, some as grey as his. Enforcement pushed forward. always a step behind the next wave of cleverness. He recognized the patterns. People always found ways to game systems. Governments always tried to catch up. The specifics changed. The dance stayed strangely familiar. He did not spend his days arguing with the past. Regret was there, but he did not let it swallow everything. He accepted that he had made choices that brought harm as well as stability, that he had participated in a structure now widely condemned. He also accepted that he could not go back and redraw the routes or rewrite the agreements. What he could do was live the time left to him with a quieter kind of attention. When he passed a corporate garbage truck in a parking lot, he sometimes paused to look at it, the logos, the safety stickers, the barcodes. He greeted the drivers if they caught his eye. Some nodded back with the automatic friendliness of working men. A few older ones looked twice, as if trying to place his face from an earlier chapter in their own lives. Once, an older driver approached him in a supermarket lot. He had lines around his eyes and a walk that spoke of long days climbing in and out of cabs. The driver said that he had worked for one of the old companies back when things were different, and that he remembered hearing Salvatore's name. He did not sound accusing, just curious. They talked for a few minutes about how the work had changed. The driver complained about new paperwork, about electronic logs, about the pressure to complete more stops in fewer hours. Salvatore listened and found himself giving the younger version of his usual advice. He told the man to watch his back, to lift with his legs, to keep an eye on blind spots. He said that bosses came and went, that policies changed, but that a man only got one spine and a limited number of years when his hands could grip metal in the cold. The driver laughed and thanked him. As he climbed back into his truck, he said that the old-timers always had the best tips. Then he drove off to run a route designed by a computer. In moments like that, Salvatore felt a thin thread connecting his past and present, stretched but unbroken. He was no longer the man who kept the map of routes in his head for an entire borough, but he still understood the basic truths of the work. The world around him moved in slow motion and fast motion at the same time. Days at home passed with a predictable rhythm. The larger world flashed new headlines at dizzying speed. He chose, as much as possible, to live in the slower lane, to walk to the corner store instead of driving, to sit on a bench in a small park built over old refuse and listen to children argue about playground rules, to take his time carrying trash cans for neighbors on cold mornings, remembering with each step the weight of things people throw away. In the distance, at certain hours, he could still hear the faint growl of compressors and the roll of heavy tires on asphalt. That sound, once a symbol of control and profit and potential trouble, had become, for him, the background music of ordinary life. A reminder that the city and its edges were still breathing, still consuming, still discarding, still relying on unseen hands to keep the cycle going. He had been many things in connection to that cycle: manager, enforcer, negotiator, defendant. In the autumn of his life he was content to be something smaller and simpler. A man on a quiet street, listening to the echo of trucks in the night, and accepting that the world had moved on, carrying his history with it like another load sent to a distant landfill, covered over but never entirely gone. Chapter 9. The Last Route. The first time he helped his neighbour with the trash cans, it was almost an accident. It was a cold morning in late autumn. The air had that crisp bite that woke up his lungs and made his joints complain. Frost clung to the roofs and the grass. He stood at his window, coffee in hand, watching the block prepare for collection day. Across the street, old Mr. Rossi was wrestling with a heavy can. The man had been strong once. You could see it in the way his shoulders were built, even though they had settled now. But age had a way of sneaking weight into everything, especially metal and plastic. The can tipped, not all the way, just enough that one wheel lifted off the ground. Rossi steadied it and stopped, breathing hard, his hand pressed against his side. Without really thinking, Salvatore set his mug down and stepped outside. The cold air slapped him awake. He crossed the street. His feet knew this walk even though until then he had only taken it in his mind. Rossi turned, surprised, as Salvatore reached for the handle. "Let me," Salvatore said simply. No fanfare, no long explanation. He tilted the can onto its wheels with the practiced angle of a man who had done this thousands of times in other lives, on other blocks for other reasons. The weight rose smoothly. Muscles remembered what years and courts could not erase. Rossi protested once out of pride, then let it go. His breath came easier. He made a small joke about being outpaced by a man who had spent some time away and should be taking it easy. Salvatore gave a half smile and said that this was his kind of exercise. He rolled the can to the curb and set it down in a clean line with the others. The small click of plastic against pavement felt strangely satisfying. On his way back to his own house, he noticed another neighbour, a widow 2 doors down, struggling with a lid that had frozen to her can. He stopped there too, tapped the edge, lifted it free and brought her container out for her. By the time he went back inside, his hands were cold and his cheeks stung, but there was a lightness in his chest. It reminded him of the early days, when the business still felt like a simple exchange of service for payment, before the layers of politics and quiet threats had settled over it. The next collection day he did not wait for accidents. He put on his jacket and gloves as the sky was just turning from black to blue and stepped out with purpose. He went from yard to yard on his side of the street and then the other, asking softly if people wanted a hand. Some already had their cans out, others gratefully accepted. A few protested at first out of habit, then nodded and stepped aside when they saw the ease with which he handled the weight. This became his route. No money changed hands, no one reported to anyone above him. There were no envelopes, no coded conversations, no hidden ledgers. There was just him, moving along the sidewalk, turning private effort into public order. It felt, in a small way, like a penance, though he did not use that word aloud. It also felt like a way to stay connected to the work that had shaped his life without stepping back into the shadows that had darkened it. On some mornings, young parents rushed out in slippers, embarrassed that they had overslept and had not yet dragged their cans out. He waved them back inside, saying he had it covered. They thanked him with hurried relief and sleepy smiles. He learned the rhythm of the block this way, who worked night shifts and needed quiet, who left early for the train, who tended to forget which days were collection days until the truck noise stirred them. He moved at a deliberate pace. There was no dispatcher pushing him now, no schedule to squeeze. The truck would come when it came. His job began and ended at the curb. After a few weeks, someone left a note on his door in careful handwriting. "Thank you for helping with the cans. It means more than you know." There was no signature. He knew which house it had come from, but he respected the anonymity. Gratitude did not need full names. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen. The house was quiet. The television in the other room murmured about sports scores. His wife had gone to bed early with a book. He stared at the blank page for a long time. Then he wrote a name at the top. A name that had appeared in every article about the independent haulers who once challenged the routes he served. A name tied to that summer which had marked the end of the old system and the beginning of his long journey through courts and cells. He did not have the address. He doubted he would ever use a stamp on what he was about to write. That was not the point. He began with simple words. He wrote that he had been part of something that had caused harm, that the way he had understood the business then was not the way he saw it now, that he knew there were families who had lived through loss because of decisions made by men like him, in rooms where words such as peace and stability were used to cover harder realities. He did not pretend innocence. He did not list excuses about the era or the culture or the pressures from above. Those were factors, but they did not erase the outcomes. He wrote about routes and maps, about how he had once seen the city as a puzzle to be solved in the most efficient way. He admitted that in treating it as a puzzle, he had forgotten that every line on that map represented people with their own plans and rights and fears. The words came slowly at first, then in a steadier flow. He was not a poet and did not try to be. He kept the sentences plain. At some point, he found himself writing a sentence he had never spoken aloud. If I could go back, I would draw some of the lines differently. He sat back and read what he had written. The letter was not long, but it carried more weight for him than many of the documents he had signed in his business years. He folded the sheet and placed it in a plain envelope without sealing it. On the front, where an address would go, he wrote just a surname. Then he put it in a drawer. In the weeks that followed, he wrote other letters at the same table. Some to families of men who had served time alongside him. Some to distant relatives he had neglected. Some again to the names of independent haulers or customers whose lives had collided with his in court captions and news stories. He did not mail most of them. He kept them in that drawer like a private ledger, a record not of debts owed by others, but of debts he carried. On some nights he took the stack out and reread a few pages. The words did not change anything that had already happened. They did not bring anyone back or erase any sentence. But they made his thoughts less cloudy. They gave shape to feelings that might otherwise have stayed as a dull, formless weight. His wife discovered the letters one day while looking for a pen. She stood by the drawer for a moment, reading the top lines of where open sheet. Then she closed it and said nothing. Later that evening she told him that everyone had their own way of talking to the past, and that if this was his, she would not interfere. He nodded, grateful. There was a quiet kindness in her restraint. Outside the house, life on the block continued. Children grew, cars changed, new families moved in bringing different languages and cooking smells to the street. One of the newer neighbours was a young couple with a small boy who loved trucks. On collection days, the child would stand at the window or on the steps, pointing and shouting in delight as the big vehicle approached. Salvatore sometimes timed his own route for those mornings, so that he would be outside when the truck came. He watched the boy bounce on his toes as the arm rose and the can tipped. One day, the child ran up to him afterward, eyes wide, and asked if he had ever driven none of those. For a moment, time folded. He saw himself behind the wheel of a dark sedan with a boss in the passenger seat. He saw the yard at dawn, trucks lined up like tired horses waiting for their turn. He saw drivers laughing as they climbed into cabs, unaware of the legal storms that years later would sweep many of them into headlines and cells. Yes, he said slowly. Long ago. Was it fun, the boy asked. He considered the question carefully. Some parts, he answered. The early mornings, the satisfaction of finishing a long route, the feeling that you were part of making the city livable. He did not mention the meetings, the pressure, the calls from Brooklyn, the nights that ended with him staring at the ceiling wondering where the line between keeping order and causing harm had been crossed. The boy nodded, apparently satisfied. Then he ran back to his mother, who waited at the stoop with a smile. As the boy grew, he sometimes came over to help Salvatore move cans, pushing small ones while the older man handled the heavier ones. They turned it into a kind of game, measuring who could line up the straightest row on the curb. In those small competitions, Salvatore saw a different way a life connected to trash could unfold. Not through fear and hidden rules, but through simple service and the occasional delighted shout of a child watching a machine do its chore. The seasons turned again. Leaves piled at the edges of driveways. Snow came and went, leaving salt stains on the sidewalks. In spring, the park built over the old landfill filled with joggers and families. He and his wife sometimes walked there, following paths that curved over buried history. Near the top of Wat Hill, there was a bench that overlooked a small pond. Ducks paddled across the surface, leaving ripples. A sign quietly explained how methane vents had been installed under the ground, how layers of soil and protective material sealed old waste away from the fresh grass and playground equipment. He read the sign every time he passed it. It was strangely comforting to see technology and effort put into covering what had once been dumped without much thought. He understood that you could never fully erase what had been buried, but you could try to keep it from harming anyone else. In the evenings he returned to his place by the living room window. The chair air had moulded to his shape over the years. The lamp beside it cast a small circle of warm light. He watched the street settle. Porch lights blinked on and off. A delivery van hummed past. Somewhere, a garage door opened and closed. He found himself breathing more slowly in those moments, as if matching his lungs to the pace of the block. The past did not vanish. It lived with him, in the letters, in the memories that rose whenever a truck engine growled in the distance, in the legal records that would forever carry his name. Yet the present had its own weight. He could hold a trash can steady for someone who could not. He could listen when a neighbour needed to complain about taxes or weather or the price of bread. He could answer a child's questions about machines without turning every answer into a confession. One night, as he stood at the window, he realised that he no longer expected the sound of sirens for himself. For years, every sudden wail in the distance had made him tense. Old reflexes he had not admitted to anyone. Now, when he heard them, he felt concern for whoever they were rushing toward, but he did not feel the old jolt of personal fear. His life had narrowed, but it had also clarified. He knew where his days began and ended. He knew which small acts were his to perform. The route he walked now was only a few houses long, but it was his last one, and he tried to walk it with more care than any he had ever been paid to run. Chapter 10. Night Drive. The idea for the night drive came from his granddaughter. She was no longer the child in the glitter costume pinned to his refrigerator. She was a grown woman now, with a job in the city and a small car that still smelled faintly of new upholstery and coffee. One Sunday afternoon, as they sat at the kitchen table with plates of leftovers between them, she mentioned that she sometimes drove through certain parts of Queens and Brooklyn after work, just to clear her head before heading back to her apartment. He smiled at that. He had done his own thinking behind a wheel once, though his paths had been mapped for reasons she only half understood. She looked at him thoughtfully and asked if he ever missed driving those routes. Note the business, she added quickly, just the feeling of moving through the city at night. He paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. The question settled in the air like dust in a sunbeam. Sometimes, he admitted, the roads get into your bones. She tilted her head, considering. What if I took you for a drive one night, she said, just to see some of the old places. No business, no meetings, just us. His first instinct was to refuse. It felt unnecessary, indulgent even, but there was warmth in her eyes and curiosity that did not come from morbid interest. She wanted to see the city through his memories, not through headlines. All right, he said slowly, one night. They chose an evening when the sky promised to be clear. After dinner, he put on a dark coat and a soft scarf. His wife kissed his cheek and told him not to stay out too late, with a hint of mock sternness that made them both smile. His granddaughter's car waited at the curb, small and sleek compared to the heavy sedans of his past. The dashboard glowed with digital lights and maps. She adjusted the seat so he could get in comfortably, then pulled away from the curb with careful confidence. They took the expressway toward the city, merging into the steady stream of headlights. Overhead lights swept across the windshield in regular beats. He sat in the passenger seat, watching the familiar road roll up under new tires. He remembered every curve, every sign, every exit that once represented a yard, a meeting place, a problem account. She asked him to point out landmarks as they went. Here, he said, nodding toward a shadowy line of trees beside a sound barrier. There used to be an old sign for a diner where drivers met after night routes. Over there, he gestured toward a cluster of taller buildings, was once a modest office where accounts were arranged in ways that never appeared on official invoices. Some of the old spots were gone, replaced by new constructions, shopping centres, glass facade. Others lingered, aging quietly among the modern additions. She drove them off the expressway and onto local streets in Queens. The city lights changed quality here, closer to windows and crosswalks. They rolled past stretches of small stores, laundromats, restaurants and garages. Some names were in languages that had not been common here when he first started. He pointed out a corner where there had been a club once, a place that had smelled of espresso and cigarettes and anxious men in pressed shirts. Now a bright pharmacy occupied the space, with wide windows and clean light. He described a back room that no longer existed, where they had once discussed routes and percentages, speaking softly over the clink of cups. His granddaughter listened, glancing between the road and his lined face. "Did you ever feel afraid," she asked at one red light, "when you were going to those meetings?" He thought about it. "Not in the way people think," he said. "I was more afraid of letting things spin out of control, of chaos. That was the story I told myself. He did not say that sometimes, much later at night, fear of different kinds had crept in and kept him from sleep. They crossed into Brooklyn. The streets here carried older memories. He had driven these blocks with bosses in the passenger seat, their quiet presence both reassuring and heavy. He saw a particular corner where he had once parked for a quick conversation with a union man who had been nervous about too much attention from the city. The store on that corner now sold cell phones and accessories, glowing screens in the window. He chuckled softly. "What?" she asked. "Once," he said, "if you wanted to keep a secret, you needed a quiet corner and maybe a payphone. Now people carry little machines in their pockets that can record everything and send it everywhere in a heartbeat." She laughed, recognizing the truth of this. They continued toward a part of Brooklyn where one of the companies linked to his case had been based. The yard had long since been closed, the land eventually reused. They found the approximate block. It was dark now, lined with newer buildings and Mant's fenced lot used for parking delivery vans. He asked her to stop for a moment. They sat with the engine idling. In the dim outline of the lot, he saw shadows of old trucks lined up, men in work jackets drinking coffee from thermos bottles, a younger version of himself checking off names on a clipboard. In reality, the space was mostly empty. A stray cat slid along the fence. A streetlight flickered. "Hard to imagine," she said softly, "that all of that was here." He nodded. "Sometimes," he replied, "I almost cannot believe it myself." They moved on. On a wider avenue, they passed a corporate office of a large waste management company. The logo on the sign was unmistakable, even at night, bright and confident. He noted the multiple cameras facing the driveway, the neat row of modern trucks behind the gate. "There it is," he said, "the new version of what we tried to control." She slowed a little, looking through the fence. "It looks so normal," she said. "That is the idea," he answered. "Normal is safer." They did not linger there. The point of the drive was not to brood over replacements. It was to draw a kind of gentle line through the past and the present. On their way back toward the expressway, she asked him to tell a story from the old days, but done that would not keep either of them awake later. He thought for a moment, sifting through years of events. Many stories came with sharp edges he did not want to expose her to, even in softened form. Finally, he settled on one. He told her about a snowstorm in the late 1970s that had snarled the city when many trucks had given it and routes were abandoned. He and a few stubborn drivers had pushed through drifts to reach a hospital that was desperate to keep its loading areas clear. He described chains on tires, men shoveling in shifts, coffee steaming in paper cups as snow piled on their shoulders. He told her how the hospital staff had clapped when the trucks finally managed to clear the packed waste and make room for more. That, Anne, he said, had felt good. No politics, just doing what needed to be done so a place full of sick people could keep functioning. She smiled. "You should tell more of those," she said. "There are not enough of them," he replied quietly, "but I remember the ones there are." The expressway back to Long Island was quieter now. It was late, the kind of hour when the city seemed to inhale and hold its breath. He leaned back in the seat, letting the motion of the car soothe him. The darkness outside was not absolute. Pockets of light marked exits, rest stops, clusters of houses. His granddaughter turned down the radio so that the hum of the engine became the main sound. He felt his eyelids grow heavy. For a brief moment he wondered if it was safe to let himself drift. Old instincts told him to stay alert in cars at night, but the hand on the wheel was young and steady, and there were no whispered agendas in this vehicle, only trust. He closed his eyes. Behind them, in the invisible distance, lay the yards and routes of his youth, the courtrooms and cells of his middle years, the quiet block where trash cans now marked his voluntary service. Ahead lay the rest of the highway, stretching out like a narrow grey ribbon into however many mornings he had left. He pictured that ribbon as a route without stops, a final run in which the goal was not to cover the most accounts or collect the largest bill, but simply to keep moving forward with as few new regrets as possible. His granddaughter glanced over and saw that he had dozed off. A small smile crossed her face. She adjusted her grip on the wheel, keeping the car centered in the lane. The green signs over the roadway listed exits, towns, and miles in glowing characters. For her, these places were not tied to social clubs and transfer stations. They were just points on a map leading home. As they crossed the bridge back onto the island, the lights reflected in the dark water below. From his half-sleep, he felt the subtle shift of the car on the span and knew exactly where they were, the way an old driver always does. He opened his eyes briefly and saw the arc of lights, the cables reaching into the night sky, the lanes ahead thinning as traffic spread out. "Almost home," his granddaughter said. He nodded, a small motion. The houses of his neighborhood appeared, snug and dim behind their curtains. The car pulled to the curb in front of his house. She turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was almost physical. He stepped out slowly, joints protesting, and looked up at the familiar windows. A light glowed in the living room where his wife waited, unable to fully sleep until she heard the car return. "Thank you," he said to his granddaughter. "For what?" she asked. "For the ride," he answered, "and for driving a little bit of the past into a place where it can rest." She seemed to understand, even if she could not feel all the layers of what he meant. After she drove off, he stood for a moment on the path, looking down the street. It was late enough that only one distant porch light remained on. Somewhere in the far distance, a truck engine murmured. He listened to it, not as a call to action, not as a sign of power, but as a simple reminder that the world was still turning, that someone was still out there doing the work he had once done in such a complicated way. Then he turned toward his door. His hand on the knob was steady. Inside, the house held the warmth of his life as it now was. Fewer routes, fewer secret maps, more quiet evenings and small tasks. He stepped over the threshold with the calm of a man who knew that whatever travelled behind him would always be part of him, but did not need to steer any more. The night closed gently around the block, and the last echoes of engines faded into a peace he had spent a lifetime believing would never quite belong to him.